Hi everyone, Taya here from Quilting Delights, and thanks for joining us again. Today we're going to talk about how to dress up a quilt with decorative piping. Sometimes you'll have a quilt like this one. This is a giraffe quilt designed by Bellanona Studios, and we absolutely love this quilt. It has a lot of texture and a lot of fun. But when we went to put the binding on the outside edge, it kind of lost its pep. So we want to add a little bit of piping into the binding to bring the color up and bring that red from the center out into the piping, out into the binding. So it's going to look more like this now with just a little tiny stitch of red around the outside edge, and it really will dress it up and add just the right touch to make this quilt a finished, beautiful piece. What we're going to do next to work the decorative piping into our quilt is we're actually going to create the piping. You're going to cut 1-inch strips, and if your quilt is bigger or longer or you need additional strips, you're going to sew those onto the ends. You're going to sew them end to end with bias seams so that you spread out the bulk of that, and then cut them to 1/4 inch, cut your seams to 1/4 inch and press them open before you put the cording down the middle of the piping. So in this situation, what we're going to do is we're going to use the number 23 foot, which is actually an applique foot, but in this situation we're going to use it for the piping. And the reason we're going to do that is because there's a little channel down the middle here that allows us to keep that piping tight to the outside edge. Now I've tried this a couple of different ways. I tried pressing my 1-inch strips in half, and what happens is when you press your strips in half, you actually get a crease on the outside edge, and we don't want a crease. We want it to roll over the edge of that cording. So we're going to do that as we sew. So let me get this out of the way. You want to make sure that you're using a matching thread color so that you don't see the actual stitching. And we're using a thread that is size-wise, it's called a number 16, but it's just a little bit bigger than twine or rope that you would use to tie your roasts with. So it's about 1/8 of an inch, and it comes on a big roll like this. We do a lot of piping, so that's why we have so much. And we also have this available on our website in 10-yard cuts. First thing you're going to do is put the number 23 foot on your sewing machine. And you don't need to worry about where the threads are, except that the threads are going to be, the bobbin thread is going to be on top and the other thread will be on top. With the wrong sides together, start out with the wrong sides of your fabric together, start out with a piece of the cording on the outside. Now I'm right-handed, so I roll my raw edges to the left, and I just make sure it's nice and tight here. And then you can take your tweezers that are put out by the quilting tool shed. These are awesome. And I grab onto the end of it and I tuck it right in where it needs to go. That way I know it's nice and tight. And I'm going to start sewing here in just a second. The other thing that you have to do when you get started with this, now notice that I have the cording right down the center and then I just fold the fabric over. Remember, this foot has a channel down the middle, so what it's going to do is it's going to, as you sew, it's going to push that cording to the outside edge nice and tight. Your job is just to make sure that you're managing what's happening here with the raw edges. They don't have to match perfectly because we will trim this, but you do want to make sure that they're fairly close together. If we sewed it with the sewing machine set up right now, it would sew down the middle of the channel. So what we're going to do, depending on whether you have your raw edges to the left or to the right, and you can do either, but we're going to move our needle position 3 positions to the left or towards the raw edge so that that stitching is just on the outside of the cording. And then I'm just going to hold on to my threads as I start sewing, and it's going to pull that right through, and then when I'm on the back side of it, I can take my tweezers and just pull that thread out. Notice that we're stopping with the needle in the down position, so if we have to make any adjustments as we go here, we're not losing our sewing position. So you can just sew really fast, and I'm just managing it ahead a little bit. That cording, I lay it right down the middle and sew, sew, sew. This technique was inspired by Pat Andrews, who is an avid sewist and loves to pipe anything and everything. If you stood still for more than 10 seconds around her, you would have piping somewhere on a piece of clothing or on a bag or on a bathrobe. She piped everything, especially bags. So we just are going to finish sewing this down, and then I'm going to show you how to trim it and how to put it with the binding. It doesn't take any time at all to add this, but what it does is it adds a tremendous amount of pop to the outside edges of your quilts. If you like to do wall hangings or art quilts, this is particularly useful because it does a very nice framed edge on the outside of your quilt and wall hanging edges. Okay, we're almost done, and then we're going to trim this up. The thing to remember is you always want to start with your cording longer at the beginning and longer at the end, and I'll show you why that's important here when we add this to our quilt. Okay, home stretch here. And I'm just going to use my scissors, my little squeeze scissors. Cut that off. Pop my needle up, trim my threads, and we're going to go to the cutting mat. So we're ready to trim our piping. We've done all of our little pieces with the cording close to the edge using the number 23 foot. And you'll notice that these are wider. We have to get that edge from the piping stitching that we just stitched to 1/4 inch. One of the best tools ever created for piping was made by Susan Cleveland of Pieces Be With You, and it's called the Grooven Piping Trimming Tool. She has 2 different rulers, both of which have different sizes. We're going to use the smaller ruler and the smallest size. And what this ruler does is it allows us to trim exactly 1/4 inch away from the piping. It has a built-in groove underneath the bottom edge, so it's just really slick how it works. We're going to take the piping and we're going to put it underneath the groove on, when you're looking at the ruler, it's on the right-hand side. The groove on the left-hand side creates a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The groove on the right-hand side creates a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to cut up one side here. And what's really cool about this ruler is as you move it, if you're paying attention, as you move it, it will just keep that cording right in the slot so that you're always cutting exactly the same size. Make sure that you close your rotary cutter between cuts and between moving. Let me say that one more time. Close your rotary cutter. And we're just going to slide that on up and get it trimmed and ready to attach to our quilt. And when we attach it to our quilt, we're going to sew the piping on first and then add the binding second. And that's all there is to it. So we're going to do that with all of our strips, and now when you look at them, they are perfectly trimmed to the right measurement to put on our quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and ring the bell to be notified of new products and how-to videos.